Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. We are very pleased to have today for our School of Architecture and Planning lecture series, Mr. Lakhia amongst us. He is appointed recently to the National Director of Dam Safety at FEMA, and previously he served as the Director of FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, managing a national portfolio of $10 billion in disaster and non-disaster grants. He has been leading FEMA's new Brick Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, and also acting in the position of FEMA's Deputy Assistant Administrator for Recovery. And he will be talking about, as an architect, what is the role of architecture and architects in enhancing city resilience. So without any further delay, I give you Lakhia, and I will share the screen. Sarah, let me know when you.
Yep, looks great.
Great, thank you very much, Samia, for a very warm introduction. As Samia mentioned, my name is Lakhia. I'm currently the Director of the National Dam Safety Program at FEMA, but have been involved with FEMA in some resiliency role in one way or the other for the last 10 years or so, since I started working with FEMA. First thing I should mention, obviously, is the disclaimer. I want to make sure that the views in this presentation you are aware are those of the author in my personal capacity as a US citizen and not in my official role representing the views of the federal government. So having said that, the topic of today's presentation, which you all may have seen in the introduction, is the architects as policymakers have a few tools available to them to ensure that the built environment is resilient to natural hazards. First, communities can advocate for the adoption and enforcement of the latest disaster-resistant building codes. Two, communities can adopt sound land use and floodplain management practices. Three, communities can follow flood maps when not building in floodways or floodplains. Four, communities can mitigate existing structures through elevations, acquisitions, and risk reduction measures. And lastly, communities can mitigate existing structures through elevations and acquisitions. All five tools offer some degree of resilience in the built environment. However, in an age of climate change with more extreme and frequent weather events, are these measures adequate? This lecture, I believe we have about an hour. I will try to keep my spoken remarks to about 40 minutes so that we leave about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. This lecture will explore options available to architects, practitioners, and policymakers to make our nation more resilient. If our approach to risk reduction and resilience has worked in the past, albeit slowly, the question is, why not do more of the same, but faster? Do more of the same with greater speed and efficiency. If our approach to hazard mitigation has worked in the past, why cannot it continue working in the future? Over the course of the next hour or so, we will explore why just doing more of the same will not work and how we are at an inflection point. So the background. Natural disasters, both in their intensity and frequency, are accelerating. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, maintains $1 billion disaster database, a repository which dates back to 1980. The database demonstrates that not only are these enormous natural disasters increasing, the first 9 months of 2020, for example, is the 6th consecutive year in which 10 or more billion-dollar disasters and climate weather events have impacted the US. 2017, some of you may recall, the year of the 3 large Hurricane Maria, Irma, and Harvey, was a disaster which was bad, but 2019 actually was worse. According to NOAA, in 2019, the US experienced 14 separate billion-dollar disasters. And 2021 is the 7th consecutive year in which 10 or more billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events have impacted the US. Over a slightly longer time frame measured since 1980, as the graph depicts, the number of billion-dollar disasters is steadily rising. And if one plots the costs of the disasters over the same time frame, 1980 through 2019, we can see a steep increase in costs, even after adjusting those numbers for inflation. NOAA predicts that the sea level rises are expected to increase by several inches in the next 15 years. And by the year 2100, even under its low estimate, sea levels could rise by a foot as measured from the year 2000. In its extreme projections, the rise could be over 8 feet in the mid 20th century. Fewer than 20% of the counties in the US experienced a disaster. Today, half do. From 1920 through 80, so US counties, 50 US counties had a major disaster each year. Since 1980, that number has tripled, with an apparent acceleration since the year 2000. Observable effects of the environment due to global climate change are evident everywhere, with shrinking glaciers, loss of sea ice, acceleration of rising seas, and more intense heat waves, resulting in several prolonged drought and intense wildfires. The US Global Change Research Program, Climate Science Special Report of 2017, summarizes that global average sea level rise has been 7 to 8 inches since 1900, with almost half, about 3 inches of that rise occurring since 1993. This also means, and as we can see on the map on the right, that there are quite frankly some portions of the US, either due to extreme heat or drought, or rising seas, will become uninhabitable. And some of that effects are already occurring. As we may be aware, in parts of Louisiana and Alaska, we're already facing large land loss due to a combination of rising seas and coastal erosion. Which brings us to the next tool we have in our, the first tool we have in our arsenal, building codes. The National Institute of Building Sciences in 2019 updated a decade-old study of the costs and associated benefits of hazard mitigation. It represented the most exhaustive benefit cost analysis of natural hazard mitigation, from adopting up-to-date building codes and exceeding codes to addressing the retrofit of existing buildings and utility and transportation infrastructure. It concluded that investing in hazard mitigation yielded, on an aggregate, for all federal grants, an overall benefit cost ratio of 6:1. It's right here. The more remarkable finding was that when we, in fact, adopt the latest disaster-resistant building code, the return on investment can be as high as 11:1. There have been various studies done which also demonstrate that adopting building codes would save the nation $13 billion a year. Multiple reasons explain the increasing frequency of these large disasters, which we saw in the previous slide. Not only is the population increasing in many parts of our nation, but development in areas previously not as densely inhabited is at a higher risk of damage. Vulnerable areas such as coast and inland river floodplains already house much of the nation's population. Adopting and enforcing current disaster-resistant building codes help, but they cannot prevent losses completely. Through its National Building Code Adoption Tracking, BCAT, FEMA tracks building code adoption for approximately 22,000 jurisdictions nationally. The interactive GIS portal tracks 5 hazards: floods, seismic events, tornadoes, hurricanes, and other damaging winds. The International Code Council governs the adoption of building codes, and they are adopted every 3 years, the latest in effect being 2021. FEMA also tracks whether local amendments have weakened the model code. As shown in the map, Texas, for example, has no statewide building code, but the 2003 International Building Code is mandatory for municipalities only. Some municipalities have adopted the 2000 International Residential Code, but they have broad discretion to amend it. There are some states, shown in white here, that have no building code adoption at all. Nationally, that means that only about 36% of our nation have disaster-resistant building codes adopted. This abysmal adoption rate is disheartening, especially as code and above code adoption for riverine flooding and hurricane surge have a return on investment as high as 1.5 to 1 to 7, and building code saves, a recent FEMA study determined that modern building codes significantly reduces property losses from natural disasters. If you just look at the average cost for modern code requirements for approximately a $300,000 home, the cost for code adoption is $4,500, or about 1.5% of the home's total cost. The investment over a 30-year mortgage could mean that losses avoided of $48,000 cumulatively over the lifetime of that mortgage. Although far from being universally accepted, states are beginning to realize that adopting and enforcing the latest disaster-resistant building codes is one of the best risk reduction measures it can undertake, and some localities, for example, Florida and California, are adopting supplemental codes to meet their own specific hazard mitigation protection. Which brings me to the second point of the tools available to us architects, and that is land use and floodplain management. The National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, requires structures in the Special Flood Hazard Area, the SFHA, that is facilities subject to a 1% chance of annual flooding, or what is colloquially referred to as the 100-year flood, and purchased through a federally backed mortgage, most homes in the United States, to carry flood insurance for the duration of the mortgage. Generally, an average homeowner mortgage is at least 30 years. However, cities routinely flout the NFIP regulations. A recent report showed that nearly 250,000 policies are in violation, costing the federal government about $1 billion in flood claims in the past decade alone. Local communities responsible to monitor and enforce regulations know that FEMA rarely puts NFIP participating communities on probation, and suspension from the NFIP program is even rarer. Communities that had compliance issues identified remain non-compliant even 2 years after they were put on notice. FEMA annually funds the Community Assistance Program, State Support Services Element, CAP-SASE, which according to FEMA helps state proactively identify, prevent, and resolve floodplain management issues in participating communities before a flood event even occurs. For 2020, the total amount available to all states and territories was a meager $10.4 million. The money spread out over 22,493 NFIP participating communities does not go far. Flood insurance, which requires communities to adopt minimum planning and building standards in floodplains, is a form of mitigation, commonly referred to as the NFIP minimum standards. Adopting these standards are a prerequisite to participating in the NFIP, and a vital tool governing building and reconstruction in the SFHA. These standards aim to protect the natural and beneficial functions of the nation's floodplains and reduce flooding. NFIP compliant structures have resulted in $2.4 billion per year in reduced flood losses, saving the nation more than $100 billion over the last 40 years that NFIP has been in existence. But FEMA has not revised those standards since first introduced in 1975. and FEMA has just begun the process of updating them, and its public notice explicitly acknowledges that climate change exacerbates the risk of flooding to homeowners. Specifically, it asks whether NFIP minimum standards should consider future risk and sea level rise. On the right-hand side, you see a map of properties which are known as RL or SRL. That is repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss properties. Now you can look up the technical definitions for them, but basically, as the title implies, these are properties which repeatedly flood. A large part of the insolvency of the NFIP is due to the fact that the financial burden caused by these RL and SRL properties, according to the 2019 Congressional Research Service report that studied the issue, that these properties, although small in number as compared to the total 5 million policies in effect, constitute the highest number of claims. The Pew Charitable Trust, which studied NFIP extensively, has determined that RL and SRL properties face no limits on the number of claims they may submit or on a value of payment they may receive. The Pew Trust also found that historically, repeatedly flooded properties have accounted for just 1% of properties with the National Flood Insurance Program, but about 25 to 30% of all flood claims. The data demonstrates that this disproportionate burden of RL and SRL on NFI program, and that buying out these properties at 90 or 100% pre-disaster appraised value makes sense. Since 2013, FEMA has made 89 million to 199 million in grants available through its FMA, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, to buy out these properties. But despite best efforts to buy these properties out, which we will see shortly, we will also realize that many of these properties continue being a drain, and the amount of funding available each year is not enough to solve the problem for good. On the left-hand side, we can also see that the risk is changing as greater and greater communities, and especially coastal areas, are prone to excessive flooding or sea level rise. We can see the demonstrably larger risk in many parts of our nation. Which brings us to the question of flood mapping. The NFIP's goal, which we discussed briefly earlier, have always been broader than just insurance. Besides providing flood insurance, encouraging sound floodplain management, identifying and mapping risk are critical components of the program. Flood maps serve to communicate flood risk to the public and serve as the basis of establishing flood insurance premium rates. The nation's flood maps, which ought to guide and regulate development in the floodplains, are either non-existent or outdated. FEMA develops flood insurance rate maps, firms that determine a community's flood risk, and a report by the American Society for Floodplain Managers, ASFPM, found that, I'm sorry, yeah, the ASFPM in 2020 concluded there are approximately 3.5 million miles of streams and rivers and 95,471 miles of coastlines in the nation, but currently only 1.14 million stream miles and 45,128 shoreline miles have flood maps. In other words, only about a third of the nation has been mapped. The report summarized that roughly 15% of the 22,000 communities that participate in the NFIP have maps that are 15 years old. Many of those are over 40 years old. According to ASFPM, the federal government should spend as much as $11.77 billion to update flood maps. FEMA's flood mapping budget is about $263 million a year. And last year, in 2021, 2 years ago, the congressional budget justification decreased the flood mapping budget to 163 million. As building and land development increases, land permeability diminishes, and is more susceptible to flooding, map updates are meant to reflect these changes. FEMA's maps examine historical flooding as a predictor of current flood risk, but do not include future projections and climate change. However, history alone cannot serve as an infallible guide to the future. Threats change over time, increasing with rising seas, coastal development, and climate change, putting an increasing number of US homes, cities, and infrastructure at risk. Based on 2000 census data, research conducted by FEMA found slightly more than 3% of the US population, or about 8.6 million people, in the conterminous United States live in the SFHA. And according to the study in 2018, the number may be closer to 41 million. The 41 million sum increases to more than 60 million for those who live both in the 100-year and the 500-year floodplain. Recognizing the limitation of FEMA's mapping program, the nonprofit First Street Foundation has created a flood tool to let homeowners determine their own flood risk. The figure on the right shows darker blue areas where people are unaware of or are underestimating their flood risk. And in some cases, as you can see, by significant amount of underestimation, the dark blue representing 8 times that they're underestimating the amount of flood risk they may have. 46 million properties across the country are at substantial risk, of which 5.9 million properties and property owners are currently unaware of or underestimating the risk they face because they are not identified as being within the SFHA. The map on the left shows the age of effective date for FEMA maps. And as you can see, the dark red areas represent maps which are over 40 years old. Which brings us to the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. As mentioned previously, floods are among the most common and costly natural disasters. And more than 50 years ago, in 1968, the federal government created the NFIP to ensure flood losses and to encourage sound floodplain management practices. To promote participation in the NFIP, the government initially offered relatively inexpensive insurance. Many NFIP insured properties continue to drain the fund as they repeatedly flood, as we mentioned in the RL and SRL problem. Congressional efforts to put the NFIP on actuarially sound footing have mostly failed. 5 minutes. Are we okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. NFIP, congressional efforts to put the NFIP on sound footing has mostly failed, and the program falls short of securing communities against floods. And indeed, in some ways, NFIP may actually be making things worse by encouraging rebuilding in the same flood-prone areas after a disaster, perpetuating the disaster cycle. According to FEMA, a little more than 5 million policies in effect are spread out over the 22,493 communities that participate in the NFIP. Although some 1.3 trillion insurance coverage is in place, the NFIP has only 16 billion capacity to pay claims and an additional borrowing authority from the US Treasury for up to 9.9 billion. It also has an outstanding debt of 20.5 billion, even though the Treasury forgave 17 billion in debt after Hurricane Sandy. FEMA argued with some validity that the NFIP was never designed to address catastrophic events. And the program was solvent until Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but it has never recovered, as you can see in the graph on the left, that after each large disaster event, such as Katrina, Sandy, Harvey, Maria, and Irma in 2017, the debt would have been much higher, as you can see in the graph on the right. The last comprehensive effort by Congress to put the NFIP on sound structural footing was in 2012 with the Bigot's Water Flood Insurance Reform Act. And the act directed FEMA to remove the discounts for some policyholders and provide insurance rates that are more accurately reflected flood losses. Because of rising concerns for premiums from constituents in multiple communities, Congress passed the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2014. And this act actually rolled back many of the changes implemented under Bigger Waters 12. Similarly, within a few weeks of rollout of Risk Rating 2.0, FEMA's latest effort to charge insurance premium commensurate with risk, several senators wrote to FEMA opposing rate hikes and urging FEMA to delay implementation. Which brings us to hazard mitigation. So national disasters are unpredictable, and in the last 3 decades, as we have seen, there have also been increasing in frequency and intensity. Building resiliency in the face of these disasters is a challenge. And to alleviate the federal cost of disasters, Congress in 1974 and amended in 1988 passed the Stafford Act. It provides the federal assistance in the form of grants to mitigate the impact of future disasters, and hazard mitigation offers communities the technical guidance, the tools for sound building construction and infrastructure protection, floodplain management standards, and of course, money to reduce risk. Hazard mitigation is any sustainable action that reduces or eliminates long-term risk to people and property from future disasters. As mitigation breaks the sequence of damage and reconstruction, it offers lasting and permanent solutions to reduce the future impact of disasters. And in these ways, the Stafford Act provides immediate relief from disasters, but also ensures that reconstruction occurs in a resilient manner. FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program has funded over 15 billion worth of mitigation projects over the last 30 years. These programs have successfully mitigated at-risk structures by minimizing or eliminating recurring disaster losses, reducing suffering, damage to property, and loss of life. The HMA program offers homeowners the ability to sell their flooded or at-risk properties at pre-disaster appraised values, and local governments demolish the acquired home, and the land is deed restricted in perpetuity as open space. By eliminating the risk forever, HMA reduces future disaster costs. And in this context, the HMA represents a workable approach to managing flood-prone disasters in the United States. Despite these apparent successes, the HMA program has drawbacks, as one can see on the slide on the right. The average time for a buyout is from 2 to 5 years, and there are structural problems that exist within the system that FEMA provides grant to states, who in turn provides grants to local communities, who finally solicits interest from homeowners. Each step adds time to the process, and as the program is voluntary, homeowners may change their mind at the last moment. It also means homeowners can rebuild even in highly flood-prone areas. Additionally, few homes sold in a neighborhood lead to checkerboarding, which in turn contributes to urban blight without changing the risk profile of a community in any meaningful way. HMA current programs in place, as we mentioned earlier, the RL and SRL count continues rising, and there is very little incentive for a homeowner to relocate despite repeated floods. The flooding problem is liable to get several orders of magnitude worse, and FEMA's home buyer program are not equipped to handle an exponential increase of flood-prone structures this century. Climate change exacerbates the situation and amplifies the limitations of the current HMA programs. As climate change accelerates the intensity and frequency of disasters, the nation must prepare for changing conditions and rising costs. FEMA has bought out about 44,000 homes in the 30 years of the existence of the HMA. At this rate, FEMA will have bought out about 130,000 homes by century's end. As FEMA gets better, maybe introduces additional efficiencies, changes some of the processes, FEMA may have bought out 150 homes, let's say, by century's end. Some models predict that the 3-foot rise in seas by the year 2100 will flood 4.2 million homes, and a 6-foot increase will flood 13.1 million homes. According to scientists, millions more, about 41 million, or nearly 3 times FEMA's current estimate, may be at risk from flooding. Which brings us to the final slide. A more resilient society. The factors we have considered in this presentation, building codes, floodplain management, mapping, flood insurance, and hazard mitigation, all contribute to greater resiliency in our environment. Indeed, any of these factors, actuarially sound flood insurance policies, better maps, good floodplain management, and the latest building codes will help mitigate future catastrophe. However, if meteorological predictions about the frequency of extreme precipitation events are correct, all of our mitigation measures rigorously applied will not be enough to deal with climate change. They may only delay the inevitable. That sea levels globally are rising is an indispensable fact. On average, seas have risen by 8 inches since 1900, of which 3 inches have occurred since 1993. In a comprehensive study published in 2021, the World Meteorological Organization reported that global climate and water hazards accounted for 50% of all disasters, and economic losses have increased 7-fold from the 1970s to the 2010s. Accelerating climate change means FEMA cannot acquire properties at the same rate and in the same manner as in the past. The problems confronting the United States are several orders of magnitude larger, and by the century's end, they may be worse. These problems require bolder solutions. Climate refugees from other nations fleeing flood and water scarcity or severe drought, extreme heat, or regular floods make this an urgent issue. However, climate refugees are not strictly a cross-border problem. So this brings us to the resiliency debate and how it has evolved. Planners refer to a taxonomy of resiliency called the 5 Rs, which provide a framework for evaluating the most appropriate combination of approaches to manage risk. Rebuild allows reinforcing existing structures through elevations and developing policies that require sturdier construction techniques, implementing better building codes, for example, in the flood zone. Physical barriers like flood walls enable resist, but can only work in limited circumstances. Restore uses nature-based solutions, such as restoration of wetlands or living shorelines, to better protect from storm surge and attenuate wave action. Retain allows water retention by controlling where the water goes through bioswales and green roofs, with a capacity to absorb water during a flood. And lastly, retreat relocates people and structures out of harm's way. No single strategy is adequate to address the challenges posed by climate change, and the approach to resiliency must be a combination of these techniques. Rising disaster costs and an unsustainable NFIP and demand several orders of magnitude larger than FEMA currently can deliver could compel the United States to start preparing for various adaptation strategies. But the question also remains, why should the federal government be involved in flood insurance or hazard mitigation in the first place? It is a matter of alleviating human loss and suffering, but from a financial perspective, if one is running a business, in this case the NFIP, for example, it makes sense of getting the worst performers. And that is why for RL and SRL properties, it makes sense to purchase them at 90 or 100% pre-disaster appraised costs. It makes financial sense. Moreover, FEMA spends far greater amounts of disaster relief, often in the same areas with the same critical and recurring risk. Search and rescue, evacuation, temporary relocation, food and shelter, and repair costs have steadily increased, and GAO estimates that since 2005, disaster costs have exceeded $450 billion. The 2019 CRS report concluded that over the last 6 years, The DRF, the Disaster Relief Fund, has required sustained high levels of appropriation, including 3 of its 6 highest total appropriations ever by fiscal year, even adjusting for inflation, and back-to-back largest annual appropriations in 2018 and 2019. The consequences of climate change are at a complex intersection of the built environment. Population densities, land use patterns, socioeconomic decisions, cultural norms, and dozens of other factors determining where the human species has chosen to live for centuries. The US is a wealthy country and well equipped to prepare for and mitigate against climate change and rising seas. Climatic changes will affect places in the world that are far less able to cope with their impacts. Recovery from disasters in many parts of the world will take longer. Worse, many countries cannot afford to rebuild in a resilient manner, safeguarding against future losses and provide for the safety of their citizens. Many Pacific and Indian Ocean islands are at risk of disappearing, and for whom the threat may already be here. Many South Asian nations face the calamity of a large portion of their population left homeless due to rising sea, drought, and desertification, and staring at a hopeless future. This dystopian view is not one in the distant future. These changes are upon us and getting worse each successive year. A hopeful vision can temper this bleak future. One cannot control climate change, but collective resolve among nations can slow its acceleration. And in rare glimpses of optimism, there is a boom in renewable energy sources and indications that global emissions may be plateauing. And even though some extreme weather events are becoming more common, better forecasting, warning systems, and resilient structures result in fewer deaths. The world is getting better at adapting. Sound policies can lead to timelier risk mapping and enhanced risk awareness. They may also lead to a more robust building codes and better land use and floodplain management. Optimistically, someday these policies may also result in fiscally responsible flood insurance. Finally, it may lead to a realization that mitigation measures that may have worked a mere half-century ago cannot keep up. Scaling up these efforts will help, but will not solve the problem. The world is already in an age of climate change that threatens to get exponentially worse, and the next few years will be pivotal in determining whether FEMA can continue to run a buyout program entirely voluntarily. If FEMA can continue to pay to reconstruct homes and infrastructure repeatedly after a disaster in the same areas, the federal government needs to continue providing incentives for people to eliminate or minimize risk, as local communities and individuals generally do not have the means to undertake these actions independently. Through the right combination of carrots such as grants money and sticks such as penalties for development in high-risk areas, the federal government can guide the nation towards greater resiliency. As architects who are intimately involved in the physical environment, both vertical and horizontal, your role in resilience is ever more important. Thank you, and I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, perfect timing. Thank you so much, Kai. We can see if there are questions already in the chat. So people who are on Zoom, can you please put your questions in the chat? And are there any questions from the few audience that we have?
Well, you did answer one for me, because my question, in areas that repeatedly flood.
Can you speak a little louder so the Zoom people
I'm
can
sorry,
also
in
hear you?
areas that repeatedly flood, why do they allow reconstruction? I understand it's their personal property, but if you know this area is going to repeatedly flood over and over again, why do you allow the rebuilding?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it gets to the heart of the matter, right? As to there is something known as federal overreach, and most land use and zoning ordinances, as you may be aware, are very much the domain of state and local jurisdictions. The federal government cannot tell a community where they can or cannot build. What we can do is incentivize good behavior by making sure that we charge insurance premiums which are commensurate with risk. And also we can make sure that we withhold aid if people in fact continue exhibiting the same kind of risky behavior. And third, of course, we can give grants to make sure that people do in fact take hazard mitigation measures to build it back in a stronger, more resilient manner.
And I think, because as we talked earlier, I lived in Ellicott City. I've experienced that kind of policy from the government regarding the insurance and the grants. And I believe they were telling us that they'll pay for the first, the damage, and you have to build back to better standards. But they also have left it open that they can choose not to fund or provide grants if we continue to build in a floodplain.
That's correct, exactly.
And I think that's fair. But I'd also like to add that if you look at the world's major built environments, probably most of them are built in flood-prone areas, not just places like Venice, but London and parts of Lower Manhattan and Philadelphia and DC.
Baltimore.
Baltimore. We're all built in very not flood-prone, in areas that are questionable. Like if building permits were issued now, we might not be able to build many of those cities.
Right, and I think that goes back to the heart of the problem with NFIP as well, right? There is something human, intrinsic in human nature that wants us to settle close to the water.
Right.
But the moment we do that now, it also makes flood insurance in the private sector almost practically unaffordable. And that is why the federal government got involved in it. Well, the downside of that obviously is that there are many grandfathered property you would build in a floodplain, and their insurance premiums, if you were to charge an actuarially sound rates, would be absolutely unaffordable. And that's where we are caught in this dilemma as to how do we make people understand risk? How do we, the federal government, make sure that we provide enough incentives and disincentives so that people don't rebuild back in those areas? And then as practicing architects such as yourself, how do you in fact tell your client that it may make sense for us to invest in freeboard, for example, to go over and above the local building code. Building codes, as you know, are just the bare minimum requirement. But there is nothing to say that if you do invest a little bit more money by building an additional freeboard or whatever the case might be, you're not buying some additional premium against future risk and future climate change. It's a great question here from Abraham. Is there a possibility of rezoning the course as federal land and protecting them like a national forest? That way we can get people off that vulnerable area and we can repair and protect it for the long term. So let me break the question down into two parts. But great question. The first part of the answer is, as you may recall, I mentioned during the hazard mitigation slide, that FEMA's programs are run on a voluntary basis. That means the homeowner has all the flexibility to change their mind until the very end, until they get to closing sometimes, where they say we do not wish to move for a variety of reasons. Sentimental reasons, this is where we've always lived, this is where our families and kids grew up, or whatever the case might be. The moment we cross the threshold and we say that we are not going to run a voluntary program, but purchase properties through eminent domain, that gets into a very, very dangerous area because nobody likes their land taken away forcibly. There have been instances where for the larger public good, you do take land through eminent domain. The Department of Transportation, for example, does that. But that does get into a gray area where it is not liked by a lot of people, and it's certainly not something which we want to do in extreme, dire circumstances. Which brings me to the second part of the answer. There are situations I mentioned in Louisiana and Alaska, for example, that land is actually disappearing. In Louisiana, there is land vanishing. About a football field of land disappears into the sea every 19 minutes. And there is a town, Isle St. Charles, where essentially the land is simply being swallowed away, and it's an old traditional Native American village. And that land would simply disappear, and the state of Louisiana, along with some federal funding, essentially said that we are going to relocate the entire population all at once, simply because individual home buyouts on a voluntary basis was not a viable option. So yes, there is a two-part question, but obviously, like most of these things, these are very complex issues. But good question, Abraham.
Thank you so much, Kai. Any other questions? I have a question. How can architects get involved in revision of codes, building codes? What is the process through which architects can start integrating code revision and advocating code revision? And second part, how can you guide us as educators on empowering our future architects to do so?
So the first part of the question is actually, believe it or not, the whole code process is a very open and democratic process. Most of the codes which are adopted eventually by communities are done through the ICC, the International Code Council. And they have a 3-year cycle. As I mentioned, the latest code in effect is 2021. And the consensus code essentially means that anybody could submit a proposal for a code revision or a new code adoption. In fact, typically FEMA's Building Science branch will submit a whole list of code changes which it would like to see changed every year. Submits it to the ICC. The ICC board will debate and discuss it internally among themselves, put it up for a vote to a larger body, and so on, until it becomes adopted into a final code. But remember, adoption is only one part of the game. Even if ICC formally adopts it, the bigger challenge also remains to make sure that your local communities and your state legislators adopt the latest. Ideally, FEMA, we would love to see the latest code adopted. We will settle for one prior. So in this case, 2021 or 2018 codes are still good, because we understand that there is a process, there is a cost involved to adopting codes. So the short answer to your question, any architect, any citizen, anybody can submit changes and should submit changes for making codes more proactive. Safe rooms, for example, in schools was not a thing of a common thing. But many states, especially in Alabama, Mississippi, Oklahoma, have adopted that any new schools constructed will have safe rooms built into them. So I think those are the sort of changes which we can make sure that we as architects are advocates for stronger and good building codes. How can we as educators influence that process? I think that's, again, I'm not an educator, I wish I was sometimes. But yes, certainly something which we should impress upon all of our students, because that's something which all of us have the ability to do. And some of the best ideas, as we know, come from the ground up. So hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
You know, another comment on safe rooms. We're thinking of safe rooms in terms of weather disasters. But in this particular day and age, a safe room could be a place to take young students to avoid being shot to death. And instead of just thinking of it as protection against water, they could think of a safe room as safe from bullets. And that idea is maybe more, pertinent than what we're thinking in this environment. The same states that have the water problems, such as Mississippi and Alabama, might benefit.
Any other questions from the?
Samia, there's a question in the chat from Abram.
Abram, please go ahead and unmute and ask Abram.
I already said that, I think.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys, you already addressed my question.
Okay.
And I really appreciate the presentation and the assessment tool. I'm working on an assessment tool myself. So it was really great to see it in real time and how it gets developed and how it gets deployed, really. And I guess a last follow-up question, if you have a second,
Yes.
is about the assessment tool. How you mentioned that it would make it easier for the average citizen. Could you talk a little bit about how, you know, FEMA is looking at how this gets brought down to the average citizen, how it actually gets used?
So actually, very easily, if you just Google Building Code Assessment Tool, BCAT, FEMA, it'll actually bring you to an GIS interactive map. And the first step obviously is, and something which you may not be surprised to know, most people do not know in the house they live in the schools they go to, what the current code is. So the first thing you can do is actually type in your own home address, and that'll tell you what codes are in effect in the area which you live. That obviously becomes a very first important step. And then after that, you can then advocate to your own local county zoning officers or building code commissioners as to why is it that we're still working on a 2015 code, for example. So I think that's a very good tool. It's a very powerful tool, which I encourage you to look into if you have time.
So I think to a certain extent, that's an excellent question and a very thought-provoking answer. And I think that kind of ties into my questions part B in how to integrate the motivation and empowerment of students to think about it. That would be that tool itself. If we are looking at a site, we need to start with the existing building codes that are in the jurisdiction and also see how that code can be modified as part of the design project in order to make a building that is more resilient.
Yes.
So that would include more seeing how much pervious surface is allowed in the building code, and if none is mandated, then what can be done? So putting the mindset into the curriculum and looking at the existing building code, seeing its repercussion with reference to resilience, environmental resilience and climate justice, and then looking at the code as a design issue itself.
Excellent point, Sami, and actually I would build on it one step further. Besides the building code adoption tool, NOAA has an excellent coastal resilience site, and they have actually created an interactive map again. And just as you can check your building code in your own local jurisdiction, it'll allow you to do the same thing with floods and allow you to map based on, suppose you have a 3-foot the rise in elevation, sea level rise by the year 2100. What will it mean to your home and your neighborhood? And you can, and it's a sliding scale. You can vary the, do you want to go with a 1-foot rise or an 8-foot rise, and see what it does to your neighborhood. So I think that's again a very good, easy to use interactive tool for raising awareness as to we need to act now.
Sounds wonderful, thank you.
I have one last question for you. As a landscape architect who lives downtown in Federal Hill, and I run around the Inner Harbor frequently, you know, I've noticed that the harbor floods way more often than it used to. And I'm curious, kind of as a boots on the ground approach, what do you see, and maybe I'm putting you in a spot, but what do you see as the future in 10 years of Baltimore's Inner Harbor? I mean, are we just gonna have to get rid of all the hardscape and that hard edge and put in floodlands? And I mean, I'm just curious to see what you think.
So I don't know Baltimore as well as I should, so I apologize for that. But it's not a unique or unusual problem. I mean, many cities are facing this issue. And I think that's the reason for me to bring up that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. Some places it may be appropriate to resist by building maybe higher flood walls. As you know, Miami is facing this issue, and the Army Corps did do an extensive study to see what it would take to build a flood barrier, especially in Miami and the Brickell area. Even a small 7.8 mile stretch of wall is obviously exorbitant cost, but also a lot of environmental permits and everything else. And one can only hope that 10 years or so that it would take to implement such a project is not too late to guard against the rising seas. But on the other hand, it may not be appropriate to resist everywhere by building ever larger flood walls or barriers. I mean, the Dutch, for example, have
Right, yeah.
famous in building out, allowing flooding to happen in a controlled fashion and allowing nature to take over.
Yeah, that's what I think. I mean, I think it makes the most sense to do kind of what New York's doing with the southern tip of Manhattan and really making these parks that allow the water to come in and go out and make it much more of the natural process of the way we live.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there isn't unfortunately a one size fit all, but hopefully people start looking at all these 5 R's, which I have here in the last slide, that in some places it may be suitable to resist, and in the other places it may be appropriate to retain, just as you're describing.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
And whenever possible, retreat.
Or retreat, exactly.
But thank you so much, Kai. This has been wonderful.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you
you all
very
very
much.
much for your time and your participation.
Thank you all for being in the Zoom meeting. I am going to stop the recording and end the meeting, and have a great week ahead.
All right,
Take
thanks,
care.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.